Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. It's good to be back. It's good to be back live as opposed to not live. So here we are. I hear all this talk about drunkenness and womanizing, and I thought to myself, wait a minute, has Eric Swalwell been nominated to something? No. How about Bill Clinton? Is he running for office again? No. So who could they be talking about? It's just very strange. So the Democrats and some of the Republicans, of course, what would the Democrats be without a handful of Republicans helping them? They're trying to do a number on our friend Pete Hegseth and, of course, on Kash Patel. They're trying to do to Pete Hegseth what they tried to do to Clarence Thomas, what they tried to do to Brett Kavanaugh, but they never seem to do to themselves. It's an amazing thing. All this stuff swirling around Pete Hegseth, so much of it are absolute lies. Oh, we have an anonymous staffer from Fox who said they smelled booze on his breath. And then everybody else in Fox said, no, we didn't. Oh, excuse me. Then one of the vet organizations, Hegseth Worthwood, they said, yeah, we smelled it then too. And then the trustee writes a letter and said, no, we didn't. Doesn't matter, the press keeps regurgitating it. Then they use these reprobate, phony reporters they've used from the past to do hit jobs. They're very well practiced at this. Isn't Washington sleazy? Isn't it unbelievable? You got to assume about 2/3 of the media sleep around and are drunk. I know a few already. I could tell you now who are adulterers and who drink heavily. And you got to figure a bunch of politicians, wow, maybe half of Congress. Maybe I'm a little high, maybe I'm a little low. I don't know. But we know that's happened before. I mean, they put a slush fund together, remember? $18.2 million congressional slush fund for Me Too claims. Now, in addition to the Me Too claims, meaning sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual molestation, you know, these are our representatives after all. They had other disputes. They had to pay paid disputes and workplace claims and so forth. But a good bulk of it went towards the misconduct of members of Congress. So when I watch the media reporting on somebody like Pete Hegseth, or when I watch these politicians speaking, I think to myself, don't we really want to know who they are? Don't we really want to know who they are? This fan dance that they do in Washington, D.C., it's so disgusting. It's like the Roman Empire, the bread and circus. It's just appalling. They don't want Pete Hegseth because he's qualified. They don't want Pete Hegseth because he's not part of the good old boys top brass network. They don't want Pete Hegseth because he has no connection to the problems that are taking place at the Department of Defense. He rejects DEI. He rejects wokeism. He wants a fighting machine, a fighting machine. And so many of these members of Congress, including in the Senate, they've gone along with what the Pentagon are doing. Lindsey Graham, been there forever. But Lindsey has a problem with Pete. Joni Ernst, she's been out there leading a lobbying campaign and others to try and get rid of Pete Hegseth. See, all they figure they need are 3 or 4 Republicans that they can defeat him. And I would say this. His nomination must go forward and people must vote on the record. There must be a roll call vote so we, the people, know how every single senator votes. Every single one of them, especially the new Republican majority. How did they get a new Republican majority? Thanks to Donald Trump and we, the people. And we, the people, have had just about enough of this. But I want to go down memory lane a little bit. It's not just Eric Swalwell, who, by the way, slept with a Chinese spy. Remember her? Fang Fang? And he sits on the Judiciary Committee, the Homeland Security Committee. Remember how Nancy Pelosi ran to his defense? Of course we're not going to remove him from Homeland Security. He's our guy. What about the Lion of the Senate? Anybody remember Ted Kennedy? He fit like all the buckets. Boozer, womanizer, and on top of that, Chappaquiddick. How many politicians have a Chappaquiddick in their background? A Mary Jo Kopechne? Not many. They wanted him to be president. There was a big deal when he passed away, on and on and on. He was celebrated, the Lion of the Senate. Bill Clinton was accused of rape by Juanita Broaddus. Other women came forward, accused him of molesting them, of other grotesque acts and so forth. And they had a war room at the White House. My recollection is George Stephanopoulos, I believe, was in charge of that war room. And of course, now he's a lead newscaster for ABC News. He's really focused, on Hegseth. We got to get to the bottom of this Hegseth. Lyndon Johnson was a complete sleazeball. he was the worst of the womanizers, and there were many in the Oval Office. Did the media report on it? They knew about it. He was a womanizer when he was the Senate Majority Leader. They knew about it. No, shh. John Kennedy, Camelot. John Kennedy, womanizer of the worst sort. Robert Kennedy, womanizer of the worst sort. They knew it. They knew it. Dwight Eisenhower was said to have a girlfriend for most of his time in World War II. I'm not putting people down. It's the truth. Was he a good general? He's a damn good general. Yeah, I'd say he was. Pretty good president? Yeah, I'd say he was. What do you say, Joni Ernst? What do you say, Lindsey Graham? What about Franklin Roosevelt? He had a girlfriend too, they say, allegedly, for most of his time in the White House, and he was there for about 412 years, so he was there a long time. Anybody report on that? Shh. No, don't say anything. That's our man. How about Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas? You know, in the later years, he was known to be running around the conference room table chasing women. I think he was on his 20th marriage or something like that. Well-known, alleged womanizer. I could go on and on. If you start, there's no end to this. If we go through members of Congress who are drunks, who are womanizer, it's just beyond belief, and yet they are. We have a right to advise and consent. Yes, we do. We have a right to pass judgment on anybody who comes before us here. Yes, you do. And we have a right to pass judgment on your hypocrisy. What about the great Winston Churchill, one of my great heroes? He drank in the morning, afternoon, at night, but he wasn't a drunk. He could handle his booze, but he drank. That didn't stop him from being one of the greatest statesmen in human history. But not just him. What about Ulysses S. Grant? He was a well-known drinker. As a matter of fact, his detractors, many who were jealous of him, would bring it up to Lincoln all the time, and Lincoln would say, well, send him another bottle of vodka because he's winning the war. That's what mattered. What about Benjamin Franklin, old Benjamin? Can you believe when Benjamin Franklin was in France, he was a womanizer? My point is that what's taking place here has nothing to do with any of that. It certainly has nothing to do with the truth. The usual suspects are out there. The usual media outlets are out there. The usual reporters, phony reprobate reporters are out there doing their number. They do a number on certain politicians and not on others, certain nominees and not on others. I can tell you this about Pete Hegseth. I've come to know him over the years. He's a stand-up guy. Whatever may or may not have happened in the past doesn't happen now. People go through ugly divorces. Things happen. I'm not going to pass judgment on any of that. The fact of the matter is, does he have the moral turpitude? Does he have the principles? Does he have the smarts? Does he have the motivation to be a great Secretary of Defense? And that's the answer. Yes, he does. And that's why they don't want him. I want to tell you a little story. When I was Chief of Staff to Attorney General Meese was the most decent, ethical, honorable, moral man I knew. My mentor. I learned a tremendous amount from him. And yet, throughout his career, he was dogged by congressional investigations led by the Democrats, special counsel triggered by mostly Democrat pressure. And when I was his Chief of Staff, we had 2 independent counsel investigations going on at the same time to try and cripple him. And yet, he never lost sight of the mission. He kept at it. He was Ronald Reagan's closest confidant. He went back to Sacramento with Ronald Reagan when he was his legal secretary. They were very, very dear friends. And then Ed Meese decided to resign before the term was up. I believe it was the summer before the end of the second term for Reagan. And I said, why are you doing this? He said, because George H.W. Bush is running for president and I don't want to damage his chances. I don't want to be a distraction. That's what he said. Honorable. Well, one afternoon, soon after that, we were invited to the Oval Office. Attorney General Meese and his family and his top staff, about a handful of us, 5 or less. And we went to the Oval Office, and there was President Reagan and Nancy Reagan, and in walked Vice President George H.W. Bush. I don't believe I've ever told you this. At one point, President Reagan turns to Ed Meese, and he says to him, "I'm sorry." And the Attorney General said, Mr. President, why are you sorry? They came after you because they couldn't get me. They're coming after Pete Hegseth and Kash Patel and others because Donald Trump won a landslide. Donald Trump is really a remarkable human being. They've tried all the lawfare. It hasn't worked. Nothing's worked. So they really can't get to Donald Trump right now. But they're trying to weaken his power before he's even sworn in. They're trying to trade controversies around him before he's even sworn in. So they go after Pete Hegseth, and they'll go after Kash Patel, and they'll go after others as a way of trying to chip away at him. It won't work because Donald Trump, like Reagan, will stand up for his nominees. New York Post, President-elect Donald Trump firmly threw his support behind Pete Hegseth on Friday, making clear he's still his pick to be a fantastic, high-energy Secretary of Defense, quote-unquote. Pete Hegseth is doing very well. His support is strong and deep, much more so than the fake news would have you believe. He wrote on Truth Social, which is a great site, by the way. If you haven't been there, he was a great student, and he goes on with his background. Because that's what strong leaders have to do. They have to recognize what's taking place and not go with the crowd, but stand against the crowd, and that's what he's doing. I want to tell you a little bit about our friend Pete Hegseth, 44 years old. He was deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay. During this time, as an Army National Guardsman, he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars. Following his time in the Army, the Princeton and Harvard graduate, as the Washington Examiner points out, worked for 2 conservative veterans groups to help and advocate for veterans. And those organizations were Vets for Freedom and Concerned Veterans of America. He's written 2 great books, one of them, The Need to Reform the Pentagon, and so forth. The man is not only a man's man, the man is not only a great veteran who did great things for his country. He's a brilliant man. I dare say he's smarter than virtually any Secretary of Defense in my lifetime. This worries them a lot. Then there's a piece that popped up in the Washington Post on Friday trashing his entire record. Well, those Bronze Stars really aren't Bronze Stars. That's right, the Meritorious Service Medal, that's like a participation medal. Combat Infantry Badge, well, every senior official gets those. An entire piece that goes on for column after column, trashing his military experience. Now, Tampon Tim Walz, that guy turns back, runs, really AWOL. When his unit is sent, he's the commander. Don't you dare talk about him. Don't you dare talk about Tampon Tim. No, he's the greatest we have, and so forth and so on. Baloney. I listened to the likes of McCubbin, Thomas Owens, writing in National Review. Now, this is a real man who knows what he's talking about. Hegseth has the qualities necessary to address what I believe to be the 2 most critical problems the Pentagon faces today: the lack of accountability on the part of senior officers, and the weakening of the American defense establishment's commitment to the values and virtues of the military ethos. And he goes on. Isn't it amazing that Pete Hegseth is taking more incoming than retired General Milley for the disaster he was and what he did in Afghanistan and elsewhere? Isn't it amazing to you? It's amazing to me. It's shocking to me what's taking place. So this guy, Austin, what a mess he's made of the United States military with the wokeism and the DEA, and their budget is not sufficient to do what our military needs to do. Isn't it amazing? Pete Hegseth hasn't been over there for 2 seconds. Well, no, he's a danger. He's a threat. No, he's not a danger, and he's not a threat. He'll be a fantastic Secretary of Defense. I here, for what it's worth, insist that he get an up or down vote in the United States Senate, a roll call vote, so we know where every single person, particularly the Republicans, stand. We cannot allow 3 or 4 Republicans to determine the fate of this nominee, or quite frankly, the fate of our Defense Department and our armed forces. We cannot allow that to happen. So I, for one, insist that they have a vote. And Joni Ernst and her lobbying campaign and all the rest of it means nothing to me. 0 to me. And Lindsey Graham, who's on 7 sides of 2 issues, that means nothing to me either. Or these other people. It's just outrageous what's taking place here. So we need to stand behind the patriots. We need to stand behind our heroes. We need to stand up to Washington, D.C. and all the horrible things that take place there. Because this campaign was not, as some of my conservative friends say, a class warfare campaign. So many of them are starting to sound like Mark. They're about the middle class versus the elite. No, it's not. It was about the ruling elite establishment versus the people. Those are the ones who are fighting us now. Those are the ones who are going to try and destroy this administration before there is an administration. Those are the ones who are targeting nominees. It's not a Marxist class warfare scenario. It is an Americanism versus an un-Americanism scenario. That's what's taking place. It's taking place right here. Many of the same Republicans who did little or nothing to stop Joe Biden and to stop Chuck Schumer and to stop Nancy Pelosi from hollowing out our military are now telling us what we need to do and who we need. No. We the people, we tell you what we need to do and what we need. You've screwed up enough.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.